The New Testament was written in the 1st century A.D. That's 1900 years ago. It was written at a different time and a different place for many of us, and so there are bound to be some challenges for us. When you pick up the New Testament and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are some names, some descriptions which are unfamiliar to us, which some people find difficult and kind of becomes a hindrance to their reading the Gospels. So I want us to go over some of those things quickly, and you can find more information from a good Bible encyclopedia. Some of the information I have clarified, confirmed with the New Bible Dictionary. Some good articles in that, as well as Zondervan's Pictorial Encyclopedia, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, often called ISBE, and other references, of course. And then there's the Cadillac version, we call it, McClintock and Strong Encyclopedia of, and then various names. But you can confirm many of these with that. But the primary information that we need to understand comes from Scripture, and none of these things should hinder us. In fact, most of them can be understood from the Scripture by contextual understanding. First of all, the synagogue. The synagogue, in many applications, simply means an assembly. And it's often referred to in the New Testament as the place of the assembly. In that case, it's kind of like what we call church. The word church originally just means an assembly. And then oftentimes it's applied to the place, the facility where we assemble. So similar to the synagogue. It became a center of religious and civil activities and government activities for local areas. It was spread all through Judea and other places we read in the New Testament, even outside of Palestine. One thing that's important to remember is that some things we simply don't know. We don't know when it began. There are various ideas, but historically speaking, we can't pinpoint it. And that's often the case with historical elements. We cannot pinpoint where something begins, but we can notice as it develops and what its uses are, and even some of the gradual changes of its use. Other items which are interesting in the New Testament has to do with what we might call politics. We read the New Testament. We need to understand that the Romans were the ones in power in that particular part of the world, the Mediterranean world. The Romans had conquered most of these areas, and they were the ruling political entity. So you're going to find the Roman governors referred to, particularly in Luke, the 3rd chapter. There's reference to Tiberius. You also find other people. Herod is mentioned, again, a ruler. There are kings mentioned, rulers, political entities, Galilee, Samaria, Judea, those were provinces. And then you're going to find in the New Testament this unique relationship between the Jews and Samaritans, and that really goes back to the 8th century BC and things following that, because Israel was taken into captivity. The Assyrians brought other peoples in. There was intermarriage, etc., with the Jews. And the Jews did not have many dealings, or any dealings really, to do with the Samaritans in New Testament times. That's one thing unique about Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in John the 4th chapter. And the context tells you that. Culture is different. Certainly there was the Jewish culture. There were elements of culture from their history. And there was also Greek culture. The Grecian widows, I'm looking now at kind of the book of Acts, the 6th chapter. The Grecian widows were neglected in the daily ministration, a Greek influence. It involves not necessarily in many cases their ancestry, but rather their thoughts and their philosophies and how they behaved in certain ways. The Greek language was a universal language. It was what we might call the language of commerce, kind of like English today. Much of the world spoke Greek, understood Greek, and that's what the New Testament is written in. It's simply the Greek of their day, the common Greek, what they call Koine Greek. The Jews had particular, what we might call political elements, and as well as religious, because when you go back to the Old Testament and God's law for them through Moses, it was both a spiritual law and a civil law, because they were God's spiritual people, but God also gave them a geographical region. So within the law of Moses, you find various things regarding relationships with one another on a civil level. Well, that continued somewhat in the New Testament. You have the high priests, the chief priests. Biblically, there's only supposed to be one, but in the New Testament era, there were two, Caiaphas and Annas. And again, there we have a challenge because politics mixed with religion. You can read more about that. There was the priesthood of Aaron and the priesthood of Levi, or the Levitical priesthood. I'll speak more on that in just a few moments. There's also, you'll find references to the council or to the Sanhedrin. And the council or the Sanhedrin was what we might call the supreme council. There were other councils. And I've not looked at all of the details on all the councils, but you're going to find certain references in the Gospels to the councils and to the judgment. They were a court of the Jews, and they had authority. In fact, in the time of Jesus, they had authority religiously and civilly, but they could not put somebody to death. That's why, again, they had to have Pilate, the Roman procurator, governor, declare the death sentence on Jesus. But yet it was the Jews that came to that conclusion with false charges against Jesus. These are some of the elements that you're going to read about in the New Testament sometimes as confusing. The divisions of Judaism. These are something constantly referred to in the Gospels particularly. Sadducees and Pharisees are the two major parties that are revealed. These are the sects of the Jews, S-E-C-T-S, divisions or parties of the Jews. The Sadducees often were made up of the priests, which is kind of surprising to me because the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, nor did they believe in angels or spirits. We have that information from Acts, the 23rd chapter and the 8th verse. And of course, the Sadducees and Jesus, there was a conflict because the Sadducees were trying to test and try Jesus on occasion. The Pharisees were another division within Judaism. The Pharisees did understand or believe in both angels and spirits and in the resurrection. We also learned that from Acts 23, verse 6 through 9. We see that in the New Testament times that the Pharisees were a challenging group of individuals. Matthew 23 really speaks to much of their philosophy, and that is that they would bind things which God's law did not bind. Now, we cannot do that. The Pharisees did. They would build a hedge, so to speak, about the law. Well, the law said this, so let's make sure we're safe by not doing that. We got to be careful about those things even today. But the Pharisees bound laws where God had not bound. But yet, according to Matthew 23, they and the scribes would not even lift them up with a little finger. So they bound on others what they themselves would not do. But that's the Pharisees. Now we need to keep in mind that we talk about the Sadducees and the Pharisees in general speaking, but there were some Pharisees which were truly trying to serve God. And Paul was, as known as Saul in his earlier life, was one of those individuals who he said he served God with a clear conscience. He was zealous for God. And Philippians 3 talks about his zeal, and Paul spoke about his zeal. So, they were very particular about the law. They were very focused on the law. They wanted to do exactly what God said, but yet many of them went too far. So they received judgment by Jesus. Always when Jesus would judge something, it was perfect judgment. He is the Son of God. Another group of Judaism not mentioned in the Bible are the Essenes. And they, I understand, lived primarily in Judea, around the Dead Sea area, and they were communal, and they focused on purity, And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying that's kind of one of their focuses. And but again, they're not mentioned in the New Testament. They're connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls that, of course, have been found and can be very interesting and profitable. Another group that is mentioned really once or twice are the Zealots or Canaanians. Simon the Canaanean or Simon the Zealot. There's mixed opinion to that. There was a party in Judaism that were called the Zealots. They were opposed to paying taxes to the Romans. They viewed the Romans as a foreign government, and they did not want Jews paying taxes to the Romans. Some suggested it simply because Simon had a great zeal for God. The word zealot or zealous is something that was is applied to certain individuals without that party of Judaism involved. So some have suggested that. So you see, sometimes we're not exactly sure. Now, if he was a zealot from the, we might call political standpoint, it's interesting that he was a zealot, an apostle of Jesus, and Matthew was a tax collector for Rome. But when they became disciples of Jesus, we don't see a conflict between them. Being a disciple of Jesus changes us. It has to change us. Another division of Judaism is called the Herodians. And again, there's some, lack of clarity concerning the Herodians. But generally speaking, I think what we have the idea of is a party that was, inclined toward faithful to Herod and his party. Other terms we run into is scribe. Scribe was simply one who transcribed things, wrote things down, and of legal actions, but also other accounting actions and written documentation. Lawyers, I think we understand what a lawyer is, has things dealing with the law. Now, the Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, and lawyers all fell under criticism by Jesus on occasion. So you'll see those terms, especially Sadducees and Pharisees. The last thing I want to look at in this video are priests. Now, when you look at the Gospels, you're going to notice the priests, really beginning with Luke chapter 1, Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist. From Old Testament law, there is the high priesthood of Aaron. The high priest, and there was only supposed to be one ruling at a time, but the high priest was a direct descendant of Aaron, and he had many responsibilities. In fact, you might want to go back to the book of Exodus, because the book of Exodus, this is laid out clearly, and we're not going to take the time to lay all the details out. But also look at the book of Hebrews, talking about high priesthood. Now our high priest is Jesus. And the letter to the Hebrews specifies, beginning with chapter 2 and going all the way really into chapter 10, the high priesthood of Jesus is contrasted to the high priesthood of Aaron. But in the New Testament, in the Gospels, we have the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, which I've already mentioned, politics and religion kind of combined. There's the Aaronic priesthood, again, descendants of Aaron, and they were responsible for the sacrifices. So whenever somebody would make an animal sacrifice, the Aaronic priesthood were the officials responsible for that. Again, go back to the book of Exodus. There was the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood was responsible for the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle of old was more of a tent, and it was movable, and they had unique responsibilities in what they carried and how they carried it and how they took it apart, how they put it together. All these specifics about the Levitical priesthood. They did service later in the temple. So that's the priesthood. Now, that's in the Gospels. There's one thing I want to close with that I think is extremely important for us, and that's the change of priesthood. Remember, I mentioned the book of Hebrews. Jesus is our high priest today. In Hebrews, the 7th chapter, the Hebrew writer emphasized that since there's a change of priesthood, there's a change of law. We've talked about this before, and I'll be talking about it again in future videos. The old law of Moses ended at the cross. So the Aaronic priesthood, the high priesthood of Aaron, and the Levitical priesthood ended at the cross. It's part of that old covenant. The sacrifices ended at the cross because Jesus is the once for all perfect sacrifice, Hebrews 9 and 10. So now we have Jesus as the high priest. Well, what about a priesthood? In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5 and 9, disciples are called priests. And in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, we present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Hebrews 13, 15, and 16, we have the sacrifice of lips given to the praise of God. The new law, the law of Christ, the covenant of Jesus, does not have a separate priesthood. In the Old Testament, separate priesthood. They even had unique clothing and unique purposes. In the New Testament, no separate priesthood. No separate clothing, no unique clothing, no intermediary services as the Old Testament did. Hebrews 5 kind of talks about that. No titles. We're just brothers and sisters. Descriptions of the family of God. Under the new covenant, after the cross of Christ, all of those formal priests were no longer authorized by God. And certainly under the New Testament, they're not authorized. These are some unique things about the Gospels. There are other unique things as well. We'll touch on some of those as we go. But hopefully this will help you as you read the Gospels, that you'll have this foundation to build upon. And I encourage you as you study to build on that foundation. Study to understand. May God bless your studies.